This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides, so head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow Cookie to Range with me, Sarah Raven. And for the next few, it's going to be me on my own, in fact, because I really want to try to explain as clearly as I can the colour theory that we work with all the time at Perch Hill. And I've already talked about this in the past, the 4 palettes that I work with. But I want to give a little bit more context and a bit more history of how that whole system and sort of colour theory, if that's not too pompous a term, has evolved here, both in my head but also in experimenting at the garden at Perch Hill. With Josie and with all our trials and with cut flowers and with pots, basically. So I'm just going to talk a bit about context first and sort of a bit of history, and then talk about the palettes and the colours that make up the 4 different palettes. So I think it is quite good to have a little bit of history. And I guess what I've realised in thinking and writing about this is, as a child, I try and remember back to that time, and I really loved particularly an art shop. I was brought up in Cambridge, and there was a rather wonderful art shop that I think was owned by Heifers, which were the local bookshop. And I always was sort of migrated to that shop when we went on a Saturday shopping outing. And I would then migrate to the corner where there would be great racks of coloured card. And they were very colour coordinated. And I mean, I don't remember the colours now. I can't pretend that I do. But you know the thing where it's kind of black down to brown, down to crimson, down to red, down to orange. And so they were graded through a colour spectrum. And I found that sort of deeply satisfying to look at. I couldn't afford to buy them. I mean, this was when I was kind of maybe 8 to 16. But also I loved crayons for the same reason, which is whether it was a small sort of tin box of crayons or felt tips, or whether it was those rather more glamorous ones that you get in very grown-up art shops, which I was given one for my 16th birthday, and it's still a prized possession at 62. But it was in brown card, and it had 3 drawers. And again, the thing about it, which I'll come back to the importance of this, but the thing about it is that it was very colour graded. And so it went from literally sort of white to cream to all those soft, well, those pastel colours, all the way through to black at the final bottom right-hand 3rd drawer. And I just love that array of colours that you get in those packs of felt tips or crayons. And I still do. I still find I'm just sort of endlessly drawn to them. And funnily enough, I've just been clearing out my office and I found some beautiful boxes of crayons that I bought on a trip to Paris about 3 years ago. And I've hardly used them, but I just think I love it. Sort of feeds me in some way, that array of colours. And I'm sure that is basically why when I started gardening, I really have never been a very sort of minimal colour person. I've always gone quite maximalist in colour, and any space that I create tends to be jam-packed with colour. But I think also what I realised very quickly as I began to garden, and also I must sort of remind myself and us that as well as a gardener, I was very much a cut flower person, and I'm not sure I'd call myself quite a florist, but I loved walking around the garden and putting together bunches in my hand and working out almost instinctively, but then perhaps trying to work out more intellectually why some worked and others didn't. And that is, I think, how the palettes really began to evolve. And because what I think doesn't work, whether you're designing a border or a cut flower patch or a room in a house, is having yellow next to pink, next to purple, next to green, you know what I mean, next to orange, And I think you do end up with what looks like a sort of rather joyful, but a little bit chaotic sort of maybe sort of kindergarten classroom with paintings on the wall, which is joyful and totally wonderful, but perhaps not designed. And so a little bit busy for that. And indeed, I think that applies completely to gardens too. So you need to evolve a system where you don't pack everything into one visual field. You need to separate it out. And what we do here is we'll have one palette in one area and another palette in another area. And for instance, in the Dutch yard, we have one palette, and over the wall, we have another palette. And that's fine because they're not in the same visual field, so they don't need to relate to each other. But where there is the hole in the wall, you have to be quite clever because you're seeing as you walk through, you're going from one palette to another with quite a jolt. So you need to coordinate and articulate those two spaces quite carefully. And I think in, a normal sort of size house, you're looking out of your window. And I think in that first visual field, just outside your doorstep and into the first bit of your garden or whatever, you really want that to be quite a homogeneous, uniform palette of colour. But then if you have a hedge or a wall or round the other side of your house, you can have something completely different and they don't need to relate. So I guess that's sort of how I started. I started making the Oast garden here. And it was one of the first gardens, apart from cut flower trials, that I created here. And that was in 1997, 96-7, so over that sort of autumn, winter. And what I found is that I was going very consciously to a certain palette of colours. And those were what I would call the sort of rich Venetian velvets. So they were sort of crimsons and purples and sort of deep indigo blues, etc. And I loved those colours. And those were the plants that I was picking from a catalogue, very much to the exclusion of the pastels. And at the time, I think it was because two things were kind of spurring me on that road. One was I was working as an occasional florist between being a doctor on maternity leave. And so I was working with a lot of bridal flowers because, of course, what you do as a florist is predominantly you do weddings because they are the thing where people want most flowers. And so I had spent a lot of time with white, perhaps with a touch of blue or a touch of yellow through it. But the whole pastel thing was very dominant in my work life. And I was a bit tired of that, to be honest. So I wanted and was reacting to it with these dark, rich colours, which I wasn't encouraged to use so much in the bridal flowers. And the second thing is, I think very much at the time, so this was, as I say, sort of 90s, the whole very sort of sweet English country garden look was fashionable with lavender and rosemary and soft pink roses and delphiniums and peonies and, really, really lovely, magical sort of June summer garden stuff. But to be honest, that isn't the look that I wanted. I was reacting to that. And so that whole, what I would think then was quite conventional look, didn't excite me really. So it was also in reaction to that, I think. And so what happened was that this garden gradually evolved, the Oast garden, and with these dark, rich palettes. And then what I found by the first season is that palette was really wonderful and very much what I wanted. It was velvety and textural and enveloping. and sort of gave a real sense of a safe haven in the garden there, which is a courtyard garden. But certainly on a dull day, which you can get in the British Isles, where the sky was quite grey, it was verging on the gloomy and the dark and just didn't have enough joy in it somehow. It was a bit heavy. It was just a bit gloomy. And so I started scattering through another palette, which was what I call the stained glass or boiled sweet palette, to give a kind of lift and a contrast and a sort of joyful sprinkling, almost like I thought of it like if I was eating smoked salmon, which is delicious. It's more delicious with a squeeze of lemon and a scattering of black pepper over it, because it's a contrast in flavour to that richness, isn't it? You've got the sort of sharp, slight spiciness of the black pepper, and you've got the sharp citrus thing of the lemon. And that's exactly how I thought of it. So with the rich colours, the crimsons and the purples and the magentas and the deep burnt oranges, they were wonderful, but they were even more wonderful with a spritz of this brighter, bold, sweet palette of perhaps lemon or lime or a sharper orange, a real kind of tangerine orange rather than a blood orange, if you see what I mean. And that lifted it. And that was such a good union. That was such a good marriage. And so there, through working in the garden, I'd evolved these two very distinct palettes, which are still incredibly important to me and still form the real backbone at Perch Hill. And funnily enough, I've been looking back because I'm going to be teaching a whole new course on this next spring. And I've been looking back. And of course, it reminded me as I did that I wrote The Bold and Brilliant Garden about the Oast Garden, talking about exactly this. And that came out in 1998. And that was about the evolution of the Oast Garden and creating this jungly, velvety, enveloping, but also rather joyful haven garden. On the back of that, also, I ended up doing a garden at Chelsea for the Telegraph newspaper. I wrote for them weekly at the time, and they very kindly asked me to do one of their big gardens on Main Avenue at Chelsea in 1998. And it was daunting, but it was great fun. And I'll come back to that. But that was full of exactly these colours. So the background was, the rich velvets, but the foreground was orange geums and orange mechanops, orange poppies, Welsh poppies, yellows, lots of euphorbias, and that wonderful plant, Smyrnium perfoliatum, which is a wonderful, wonderful acid green. And funnily enough, Mechanopsis, the really extraordinary turquoise one, because turquoise also is wonderful against the rich Venetian velvets. And so these two things in 1998, so I finished the book and it came out, and then I did the garden also at Chelsea. And those were very, very much based in the first two palettes. But then, I guess, more recently, maybe in the last 8 to 10 years, what I found is just working with those two palettes, it excluded too much. And so we had almost no whites in the garden here. And if white seeded into the Oast garden, we would take them out. So like if a white foxglove appeared or some honesty or even some cow parsley, we would actually remove it because it drew the eye and it actually detracted from the richness and the sort of intensity and saturation of the other two. So we started thinking, Josie Lewis, our head gardener, and I started thinking about having a different group of palettes that were based on white around the other side of the house. And that was one reason, is that we were excluding whole ranges of colours, which were the pastels, but also, of course, we were excluding whole ranges of flowers. And I think of, for instance, alströmerias as a classic example. And British gardeners tend to be quite sort of snobby about plants, and alströmerias, because they're used so widely in the cut flower industry and because they have such an incredibly good vase life of 10 days to 2 weeks, they're used very widely in sort of supermarket wraps of flowers because they're so reliable. We tend to think, ooh, I don't like alströmerias. they're just not classy, and they've got a sort of slightly perhaps old lady image about them in some way because they are so reliable. But we did a trial of Alströmerias, and we found that there were, in fact, lots of very beautiful, soft apricot-y colours and some whites with perhaps some washes of other colours over them. And for instance, there's one that we have here called Blushing Bride, which is white with a touch of green, a touch of pink, a touch of apricot over it. And I am not exaggerating when I say that comes into flower in May, and it goes on flowering until at least October, if not November. And the key thing, this is just sort of an aside with Alstros, is that you need to pull them rather than cut them. So just like rhubarb, you don't cut them with a knife or scissors, you pull them from the root gently, and that actually spurs on the creation of more stems that come from the base. And so that's how you deadhead or keep it going for as long as possible. But the point was, we weren't growing those in our borders because they didn't fit with our palettes. So we decided we had to, on the south side of the farmhouse, start to include some of these other plants. As I say, one is because we were excluding too many colours, and two, because we were excluding too many plants that were really good and valuable. And that isn't what the garden or me or what we do here is about. It's about really finding long flowering, reliable, easy to look after plants, and that they're beautiful, of course, but it's stupid to exclude a great tranche of plants just because they're the wrong colour. So that then spurred me on to thinking about two other palettes, and I found that I broke down the pastels into two because it really sat more harmoniously. And the two are what I used to call the soft and cool and the soft and warm, but now I sort of find that a bit mundane in the name. So I actually think of the soft and warm as a sort of restful palette. And what I mean by that is it's based on white, but it's got the warm colours mixed into it. So it's got, for instance, maybe a mahogany brown, but predominantly white. So it makes a café-au-lait colour, or it's got a sort of a stronger yellow, but mixed in with tons of white. So it makes a peachy tone. And then similarly with white and yellow, let's say, we then end up with a sort of a warm yellow. We end up with something that's like a sort of apricot. And those are all the warm tones in the pastel range, including lovely smoky putty pinks, because they're warm. And then there are the soft and cool, which I now call washed, which are very clean colours, and they're rather luminous and rather, they're sort of lit, but they are quite cool. And those are the whites mixed with a cooler colour. So you've got purple mixed with white to give you mauve, or you've got pink mixed with white to give you a cool white, or you've got yellow mixed with predominantly white to give you primrose, or an eau de Nil, so green mixed with white to give you an eau de Nil. But those are definitely the cooler colours. And so I ended up really working with these four palettes, but that is how they evolved through being used in the garden here and feeling the lack and wanting to have a fully sort of comprehensive range. So now there is literally no colour that we exclude in the garden. We have favourites, but there is no colour we exclude, because I firmly believe that favourites are really not how it should be. It's what you mix colours with that makes them either beautiful or not, or less so, not to be negative. And so that is where these palettes really help you out with a design, both us here, but also I would hope you. And we'll put these palettes in the podcast notes so you can see really clearly what I'm going on about. And so that on a sort of top layer is how I've evolved the four palettes here in their simplest form. And then I just want to touch on also what other colours within each of those palettes. And so there are the four palettes. So as I've mentioned, there is the velvety ones. There's the luminous ones, which are the sort of boiled sweets. And they are clean and luminous. But also there are the washed ones, which are with the whites, but also that are rather luminous. They're clean too. And then the final one is what I used to call soft and warm, which are the pastels, but of the warm tones. And so if we start with what I used to call bold sweet, but I now call luminous, because I think it's kind of more descriptive in a way, there are 6 colours in each of these palettes. And that's useful because it really allows you then to bring together really good border combinations. And I'll go through how to do that in the next episode. But I just want to give you the sort of real, the building blocks of this colour system through the next 6 episodes, actually. But so this one is to go through the palettes and then the colours within the palettes. And then I'll tell you how to use them in your own gardens in episode 2 of this series. So the first one that I think of in the Luminous is orange. And orange, I know, gets a mixed press. Some people, I know lots of garden designers who say their clients say, right, there are 2 rules. I don't want any yellow and I don't want any orange. Well, they are strong. And so I get that. But actually, that's exactly the reason why they're so valuable, because they add just this spritz of contrast. And both orange and lemon, that sort of really clear, bright yellow, and lime, all citrus colours, are really useful for doing exactly what they do in the kitchen in the garden. And that's how I use them. So I wouldn't do a whole orange garden. That would be too much. But it's like you might want to wear an orange scarf or an orange T-shirt, and it just brings your outfit to life. And I think they do exactly the same in a garden setting. So I would really encourage you to include a little bit of orange and lemon, or, bright yellow. But it's not golden yellow, and I'll come on to why in a minute, because that's in another palette. So it's a sort of brilliant yellow, and that would be the second, and the third would be lime. And so that is the really, really sharp greens that are mixed with a lot of yellow. And they, of course, verge into yellow at, there is a sort of hybrid point where the two almost the same colour. And there are lovely flowers, like there's a tulip called Green Mile, another one called Florosa, that have both green and yellow in the petals, and that works incredibly well. So those are the first 3 in the Luminous palette. And there are 3 others. Blue is the next, and that's really clear, stained glass blue that again is luminous. So it's lit from within. So it's those things like lots and lots of the brighter salvias. Salvia viridis blue is a classic example. Lots of delphiniums, lots of clematis, anchusa, that sort of blue, really bright, luminous blue. So that would be the next one. And then luminous pinks into purples. So this is where pink is really intense, got no white in it, it's absolutely saturated. And there's a classic tulip called Mariette, which is a really wonderful tulip in that colour. But also there are roses, lots of roses like Rose de Reche. And we have a wonderful big rambling rose here called Cerise Bouquet. And that's exactly the sort of pink that I'm talking. But that, again, merges at one side into purple. And so you get into some of the purple dahlias, for instance, or tulips, but a purple dahlia like Ambition, which has got an enormous amount of pink in it, but actually it has a bit of blue in it too. But it's not yet blue. It's more pink than blue, if you see what I mean. And the final colour in this palette is scarlet. So it's straight out red. It's like that real proper pillar box red. And it's a tricky colour, but I'll tell you how I would recommend using it in the next episode. So 6 colours, the 3 citrus, so lemon, orange and lime, a scarlet, blue and pink into purple. The next palette is, of course, the velvet. And this also has 6 colours. And these are more closely related. They're less contrasty. The first is almost black. So this is things like, there are lots of heucheras like this and lots of tulips like Tulip Sarah Raven, which is much deeper. It's got much more black in it than a crimson. But that would be the next colour, which would be the sort of crimson magentas to mahoganies. And so these are the sort of browny red wine tones. Brown at one end with the wonderful tulip called Dom Pedro, but, proper sort of carmine crimson at the other end with things like Cosmos Rubenza and even Cosmos Dazzler. So there are lots of things in that, but it's definitely redder than the Almost Black. It's got much more red in the mix. And then the next one is again quite related, and it's Coral to Brick Red. And so this is where I think orange becomes crimson, and it is that sort of bridge point. And there are lots of wonderful things, like there's a tulip slower, which I would consider to be coral, really. But then brick red dahlias, there are lots of them. I mean, for me, Waltzing Matilda is coral, whereas something like Skipper's Bronze, which is a wonderful, wonderful dahlia, really honestly does sort of match terracotta. So that would be my brick red. And then the next three colours here are a golden yellow. So this is not sharp lemon yellow, but this is where yellow has been mixed with quite a bit of orange. And so it really is golden in its hue. And there are wonderful tulips. There's one called Belleville, which is in this colour. And there are fantastic dahlias. Like there's one called Hercules, which is in this colour. And then also crab apples like Golden Harvest. So that would be the next. And then I would go into Caramel to Bronze. And this is one of my favourite plant colours of all. Absolutely obsessed with this colour because it's brilliant, scattered through for a richness. It's almost a universal colour, I would say. I really love lots of dahlias in this range, like a new one we've just introduced called Tom's Choice, which we're totally in love with. But also there are iris in this colour, and Burning Embers is a classic, and there are tulips too. So I mentioned Dom Pedro, which is mahogany, but there's also in this sort of Caramel to Bronze, there's Request and there's Cairo. So there's really quite a lot in this colour range, and it's a wonderful colour. And then very, very, very rich blues and purples. So Amethyst Indigo. And so these aren't luminous like the blues in the Luminous palette. These are much more earthy and more velvety, really, and a classic, rather beetrooty. A classic would be the Hyacinth Woodstock, but going to a dahlia like Ripples. So Amethyst Indigo is the final one in that palette. So you've got your Almost Blacks, you've got your Crimson to Mahogany, you've got your Coral to Brick Red, you've got your Golden Yellows, you've got Caramel to Bronze, and then finally Amethyst Indigo. So the next palette is, of course, the lovely, restful, comforting, soft, warm palette. And the first colour in this one is what I think of as café-au-lait. And it is sort of milky coffee, but going to straw. And there are wonderful grasses, particularly in the autumn, that have this lovely straw colour, which is so warm. And Stipa Gigantea is a classic example of that. And then Peached Apricot, which I already mentioned quite a bit, which is where oranges and yellows are mixed with varying degrees of white. And then you've got Warm Putty Pinks. So these are the warm pinks. And, you can think of, let's say, that foxglove, Sutton's Apricot, is a classic of that, through to dahlias and chrysanthemums, like Avignon Pink is a chrysanthemum. And there's some lovely, lovely dahlias like Preference, which is really putty pink. And then, really important for a bit of gentle brightness rather than luminous brightness, I do think you want sort of the plaster colour. I call it raw plaster to raspberry. And these are quite saturated, the most saturated in this palette, but they're still not got that luminosity to them that the Brilliants do. And a real classic for me here is the Dahlia Perch Hill and the Dahlia Molly Raven and the Dahlia Lou Farman. Those are just exactly what I want to mix into this palette. And then Coral to Rust is the next, which overlaps with the bronze that we talked about, but it's sort of softer. It's got some white in it. And then finally, Ivory to Cream in that palette. Final one, which is the Soft Cool palette, which starts with pure white, and that is as cool and bright as you can get. goes into mauve, which I mentioned, where purple is mixed with white, and you've got lots of things like alliums in that. And then into the cool pink. So this is where they really are, they're sort of like icing cool. And there's lots of things. There are various cosmos in that range. Lots of roses, like we have Felicia here, which is a very cool pink. And then dahlias like Wizard of Oz. And then you've got the cool ice blues, which are that wonderful, wonderful, where mauve mixes into blue, but they've got lots and lots of white in them. So they are these very gentle colours. And there are lots of wonderful plants like eryngiums and the sea hollies and perennial geraniums. And I'll give you lots of these in the next few episodes. And then the cool yellows, so the really, really cool colours moving into eau de Nil. So fritillaries like Radiana and the Cosmos Xanthos. So these are proper cool yellows. And then finally silver, which works so well with these cool colours, with, again, very much based on white, but with a soft amount of grey going through that to give you this really lovely, resonant, clean silver. So those are the 4 palettes. Those are the 6 colours that make them up. We'll put photographs of all of these palettes in the podcast notes if you want to download them. And next week, I will explain how you should use these palettes, how I recommend using these palettes in your own garden. So, see you then.
You can find more information, photos, and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.